welcome back. Business 150, Introduction to Management, and this now our second video in Module 7. Module 7 looks at the topic of decision making, and here in this second video, as you can see from the title slide, we're looking at the topic of a generic representative decision-making process. What generally is the process that we use as managers when we're called to make a managerial decision? What process can we use as a foundation, as a framework, and as a building block as we continue this exploration of the topic? Well, we hope that you will, at the end of this video, be able to specify the steps that are generally involved in decision making. Now, those steps may not be absolutely duplicatable across every single decision that you'll need to make, both programmed, unprogrammed, surprise, routine. However, the general framework should serve us well. So let's climb in. As we mentioned before, decision making in the real world gets impacted by the level of certainty or uncertainty, and therefore the degree of risk that is introduced into the decision-making process. This, of course, figure 7.1 from your textbook when you start climbing into the chapter that we're talking about, chapter 7. And what you see here is there's this spectrum, level of certainty to uncertainty, and in that will be built into uncertainty will be a level of business risk. Now, it bears reminding, as we've already mentioned in this class in another module, all business hinges upon risk. There is a natural part of risk that is entailed in all business, otherwise you won't earn a return. You have to be willing to embrace some level of risk. The question is the level of risk that is introduced not by business matters, but by environmental uncertainty. And environmental uncertainty will distill down to impact your decision making. Think for a moment the current context that we're already in, right? The world around us has changed as a result of a coronavirus and the resulting pandemic, and so a great deal of uncertainty is bound up with our view of the future, and therefore a high level of business risk depending on the type of industry you're in. Will there be a vaccine soon? Will restaurants be able to open at full capacity? Will the cruise industry and the travel industry ever come back to anything close to what we thought it was at as normal before the pandemic? These are all open questions that no one really has the answers to, and that provides conditions of uncertainty. So that will impact the importance of doing real process in order to manage your decision making, your required business decisions. And a good decision making process here you see illustrated by the textbook will have at least 6 steps. You see the 6 steps tweezed out here in this diagram. And the first step in the decision making process, identifying the problem. Number 2, generating alternative courses of action. Number 3, evaluating the alternatives. Number 4, selecting the best alternative. Number 5, implementing the decision. And then finally, step 6, it's not done just because you implemented. Step 6, to evaluate the results and assess whether or not the call you made was really, at the end of the day, the best choice you could have made. So let's talk a little bit through this. At least in the abstract, we can say that clearly the most crucial step in the decision-making process is, quite frankly, identifying the correct problem. You may be called, your attention may be called to a matter because you know there is a problem there. The results are not what you were hoping for. Performance is not what you were counting on. But that's just the symptoms. How well will you be able to identify and accurately identify the actual real problem? It's very easy to try to come up with steps to mitigate symptoms, but can you actually identify the underlying problem correctly and therefore correct the actual problem? That's really the most crucial step. Business history is replete and riddled with examples of folks solving the wrong problem and therefore still having challenges, issues, and failures as a result even after implementing the decision. So that's one of the hardest things to do, is to really do the analysis correctly to identify the actual underlying problem. Now, once you've accomplished that, then the next step, step 2, to generate alternative courses of action. If you know what the problem is, and you sort of know what you as an organization are doing to contribute to making the problem occur, then the next question is, what can we do differently? What can we stop doing? What can we do instead? What must we add in terms of an additional step or process or a different course of action in order to generate different results? We know the tired old adage that it's madness. The definition of madness is to do the same thing over and over and expect different results the next time. We know that. So then the question is, if we know what the actual underlying problem is, what are the alternatives that we might be able to use to generate better results? And here is really an interesting question, an interesting challenge. How many alternative courses of action should be come up with? Should you create just one alternative course of action? Is it necessary that you must have at least 3 alternatives? And how long do you take to generate those alternate options? And there's really no one answer to that, quite frankly. That how many the optimal number of alternatives really hinges upon what are your constraints and what does the circumstance have in terms of a deadline. How serious is the impact on your organization? Are we talking a short-term or long-term impact? There's a lot of things to consider before you can really say, hey, I really don't want to make a decision until I've got at least 3 options or 5 options or 2 options. Right? So that's an interesting question, with one without a uniform, universal answer. But you should consider, how many alternatives, how many options do I really want to have before I start evaluating them? And that's step 3, to evaluate the alternatives before you choose what you're going to select. And here, evaluating the alternatives, we have some additional discussion here. This is a slide from another textbook that I find helpful when we think about evaluating alternatives. As you can see here, there's several questions that you need to consider on every alternative that you are seriously thinking of implementing. If you have 3 options, you need to methodically go through each one of them, asking yourself these kinds of questions. You can see the first question, is the alternative feasible? Can we actually deploy this? Can we actually execute on this? I mean, you may come up with an alternative option that is simply out of your power to really control fully. At that point, is it really feasible for you to try to even start implementing that alternative? That's the second question, is the alternative satisfactory? Will the results that you're hoping for really meet satisfactory conditions to solve the problem that you've identified? And then the next question, all the alternatives' consequences affordable? In other words, once you implement a course of action, more than one thing can happen. And quite frankly, if what happens isn't the best case scenario, but something other than the best, maybe even the worst case scenario, can you afford the consequences? And if the answer to all of those questions is yes, then only then will you retain that option as one to be subject to further consideration. Let us see if I can just sort of walk you through this and give you an example. Let's say that you recognize, oh my goodness, this last quarter, the revenue for our division, the sales revenue, is down. And we need to do something, and we need to do something different than what we're already doing to try and drive up our revenue. And so you come up with a short list of examples, short list of options, I should say, I'm sorry. So one of the options is maybe you open up a new division in Fremont, California, or possibly you additionally add capital to your struggling division in Montpelier, Idaho. Those are 2 of your options that are at hand. And you ask yourself, is the alternative feasible? Do we have the resources to open up a new division in Fremont, California? And you look at your resources and say, man, it's going to be tight. It's not not like we have a whole bunch of spare cash laying around, but we could actually pull that off. And of course, if we can pull that off, then we have the resources to invest further into our struggling division in Montpelier, Idaho. So both of those alternatives are feasible, which means we can start asking the next question. All right. So you realize, of course, if either one of those options we don't have enough money to open a new, then of course immediately that drops out of the running as a viable option. So that's the first way of looking at it. Could we even pull it off? Okay. Is it feasible? That's the first question. Second question, if we really do it and we get the results that we think we'll get, are those results satisfactory given the level of the problem? And you look at it and you say, let me think about this for a moment. Okay, so if we plow in some more resources into Montpelier, Idaho, we'll probably get a bump in sales revenue, but frankly, it's not really a great big market. That's one of the reasons that division has historically struggled. Wait a minute. If we just get a small increase in revenue, that really doesn't solve our department-wide options, our department-wide problems. Maybe that alternative isn't really satisfactory. Maybe it's just barely satisfactory, and so it's not quite as attractive to us. Whereas, if we open up a new division in Fremont, California, that's potentially a very big market for us, depending on our products and services. The results of that, if it turns out well, could really be the stuff that helps us turn the corner on our revenue. It becomes much more attractive then, based upon our assessment, our analysis. Would the results be satisfactory? So then, feasible, satisfactory, we go to the third question. What if it's not such a great outcome? Can I afford the consequences? Let's see. Well, if we invest some money in Montpelier, Idaho, and things don't work out, okay, at least it's not nearly as much money as it would cost to try and start a new division. I think we'll be okay. If I try to open a new division in Fremont, California, and it falls on its face, I could be out of a job. I could lose my job. Ooh, those consequences are not so affordable to me personally. So that sort of tilts the scales in another direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that Fremont is out of the question. Just like the previous question doesn't mean that Montpelier, Idaho is out of the question. But it does put an interesting wrinkle on further evaluation and analysis. So as we return to the slide, you can see here just this sequence, this decision tree of questions that we use to evaluate the alternatives. Are the alternatives feasible? Are they satisfactory? And can we afford the consequences should things not go peachy? If the answer to that is yes, perhaps a guarded yes, as we've noted in this particular example, then I retain each of the alternatives for further consideration before I end up selecting one of them to choose to implement. And that's an example then of a basic framework for making decisions. As you can see in the slide as we return, identifying the problem, generating alternative courses of action, evaluating the alternatives as we pointed out in that previous slide, and then selecting what we deem to be the best alternative and implementing it. And then finally, evaluating the results. Well, we hope that you can now identify and specify the general steps involved in the full organizational decision-making process. And we hope this provides a useful framework for you as you think about how to methodically work through an actual decision-making process for the sake of your organization. Take care. We'll see you in the next video.